Welcome to I Wish You Could Hear This, where we explore great stories and simple proven steps to help you thrive in life, faith, and relationships.
In our research, we've heard hundreds of hope-filled strategies for marriage, parenting, leadership, and life that are grounded in science and consistent with biblical truth. And now you can hear them too.
I'm Shaunti Feldhahn.
And I'm Jeff Feldhahn.
In our events and our research trips, it's common that we talk about sex and intimacy, and that among, 75% of couples, the husband maybe has a higher level of desire than the wife, or maybe a different type of sort of initiating desire, or maybe the couple is the same. But of course, that means that there are women in the audience and couples who are in the 25%. Right? Who aren't. And usually they will come up to us afterwards and say, what about me? Like, what guidance is there for us? And although we cover that to some degree in our research in our book for Secrets of Sex and Marriage, it really wasn't the main focus. So I am thrilled that Jay Parker is here with us today because this is her main focus. And you all listening in may not fit the stereotype, but all couples can thrive in this area of their marriage. And you can too. So that's what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, and I should probably say, maybe it's self-evident in what you've just said, that this could be a PG-13 conversation. So just be aware of that. And if there's little ears listening in, just be aware.
Good point.
So, Jay, thanks so much for joining us here on I Wish You Could Hear This.
Well, thanks for having me. This is an absolute delight. I love that y'all launched the podcast.
Yeah.
Thank you.
we are very excited about it. But yes, a startup effort has been a lot of work.
Well, it's a lot of work, and there's in all startup efforts, always some room for improvement. So we've left that in there. So, but back to you. Could you introduce yourself to our listeners and maybe just give them a little bit of information about who you are, where you live, and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, sure. I have a ministry called Hot, Holy, and Humorous, which started as a blog.
Which is like the best name for a ministry. I'm so sorry, but I love that so much.
Thanks. Yeah, I thought about it just being hot and holy, and I felt like something was missing. And I was like, you know what? Sometimes sex and marriage is just humorous. So I added that one. But I started it as a blog back in 2010. And what it really was is that I had a redemption story in my life of how God had worked the greatest thing in me in my sex life. But that's not the kind of testimony that you usually give. So when somebody says, how's God really turned your life around? It's like, well, let me tell you about my sex life.
Yeah, seriously.
So, but I kept feeling like God was telling me to do something with this. And instead of being enthusiastic about it, I was very Moses-like and thought, oh God, do I really have to? Okay, I love to write. I guess I'll just do a blog post and then maybe a few people will wander by and see it. And so I was really starting the blog to kind of get God off my back, in all honesty.
That's awesome.
But he knows so much better. And so that was 14 years ago. And I really got into it and learned that I loved.
It sounds like you hit a nerve.
Yeah, I found such a receptive audience. Back then, there were a few resources about sex and marriage in the Christian space, but not nearly enough. And there was a place for new voices and new perspectives, new angles, I would say, at what we were talking about. And so I just kind of went into it and learned that I loved it. I loved reaching people about this. And so that's how it kind of grew into what it's been. And I live with my husband. We're empty nesters now, married 32 years. I fondly refer to him as Spock because he's a very logical man. So that's how my readers know him. And we are, living here in the Denton area. If anyone knows Texas, it's north of Dallas-Fort Worth.
Yeah.
So
we are so excited about your new book. Like, this has been a project that has been on your heart and on our heart for you for years now. So I am absolutely thrilled that this book is actually out there. And for everybody listening, it's called The Higher Desire Wife. And that's what we're going to be kind of diving in today, because that's honestly where you found kind of a real area of need in this area of sex and intimacy that wasn't being met.
Can I jump in here for a
Yeah.
second? This sounds like this could be a conversation of two good friends talking over coffee, you and Jay. Should guys be listening in on this one? Is this going to be okay for guys?
Well, yes. And I would say also, if you are not a higher desire wife, this is also good for those wives as well, because most marriages at some point have a mismatch in their sexual desire. And so while I'm dealing with a particular thing on the higher desire wife, and I'll speak some to that, there's really something to be gleaned about just how you approach that, how you manage it. And if you're a lower desire husband, it can also be helpful to understand how your higher desire wife sees it. And if you're a higher desire husband with lower desire wife, you might be able to speak a little bit better to your wife about what you're feeling when she hears women with these higher desires having the same experience.
That's a great point.
That's a great point. So just jump in and tell us, for both the husbands and the wives listening in to this, what was behind you wanting to write the book specifically for the women with the higher sex drive?
Well, a lot of Christian resources, marriage resources, had kind of gone in with the idea mostly that men wanted sex more than their wives. And so I love the title of your podcast, the I Wish You Could Hear This, because that was what I experienced. Is I was hearing all these stories of wives who wanted sex more than their husbands. And I wanted more people to hear this. And I also had been through it myself. So I had been in a situation where we were equally matched, and then I was the lower desire spouse after the kids came, and I was exhausted and actually had undiagnosed postpartum depression. Plus that whole, I'm just touched out. I don't know that I want two more hands touching me. All of that.
Classic.
But then I came back up and I passed him. And suddenly I was in this situation of, well, this is not good. I don't like this. And then I shared my situation, and I heard from a lot of women. And I realized that the resources out there, sometimes people say, just flip the advice. But sometimes that works, but sometimes it doesn't, because there's just a uniqueness to being the husband or the wife.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question about something you just said, about your own experience, Jay, where, you passed him? As a guy, I just thought these things were kind of like set in stone, that if you're the higher desire person, you're always the higher desire person. If you're the lower desire person, you're the lower desire. And that, what you're saying, that's not the case.
No. In fact, I would say there are two groups within the higher desire wives that I hear from. One are those wives who have been the higher desire wife their entire marriage. They got married. They were often surprised to discover they wanted sex more than their husband. But then you also have a lot of women who, around that age that it happened to me, that their kids are getting older. They've also had many years to finally kind of learn their own bodies. And their husbands also experience some decrease in their desire. And so for all those reasons, they just kind of flip places.
They pass each other.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Well, one of the things, just for our listeners to know that they've probably heard before or seen in one of our blogs, is that when we were doing the research on this with Dr. Mike Seitzma, who's a renowned sex therapist, one of the things that he shared that was a surprise to us is that these things really exist on a continuum, and they do change quite often. Like it is not uncommon for somebody, for example, to be the stereotypical guy who's like raring to go, and then he gets a little older and it's like, yeah, I'm kind of tired tonight. And sometimes I hear from some men in our events and that kind of thing that they're like, it's a little disconcerting when that happens.
Well, we never want to share too much information on this particular podcast, but I can point to a time when in our own life when, that situation, came up. And I looked at Shaunti and I went, 17-year-old Jeff would be so disappointed in me right now. Because 17-year-old Jeff, in his mind, said, if my wife ever is initiating, I am going to be all in.
I'm going to be there. I'm good for that.
This is interesting. What you're saying then is it wasn't just me. This happens.
No, it's actually really common. And what I hear men describe to me is they say, even those who remain the higher desire spouse, they say the sense of urgency kind of goes away.
Interesting.
That is interesting. And now that you said that, we have heard that many times. Yeah. Okay. So looking at the statistics in your book, you talk about 25% of marriages have a higher desire wife. We found the same thing in our study. I think it was 24%. Just baseline. There are probably a lot of people who are listening to this going, wait a minute, 25%, that's 1 in 4. Like, it's a minority, but it's a pretty big minority. Why does that just shock a lot of people, both men and women?
Like I said, this is the story that's often in marriage resources out there. This idea that men want sex and women don't want as much, but it's not just there. It's throughout our culture. So, I mean, most sitcoms will have this idea that he's always raring to go and she kind of has to tame him a little bit or whatever. And this is what a lot of people talk about. And the men will share, yeah, I really want sex. I'm excited about it. And the women sometimes will say, oh, he always wants sex. We get these messages out there. And in that atmosphere, it becomes really hard for the lower desire husband or the higher desire wife to speak up and say, that's not my experience. Because they feel like, wow, I must be the weird ones. There's something wrong with us.
Even though one of the things that Jeff and I often think, if we're doing a marriage event, because, we'll do a marriage conference on, whatever for like a Saturday morning. And quite often, the pastor or pastor's wife ahead of time will have kind of pulled us aside and said, can you make sure you cover this topic? Because it's something that is really helpful. And a lot of people aren't.
Yeah, they deal with it in their church when they're counseling a lot.
Yes, exactly. And so we always, when we're standing up on stage and we're looking at, I'm going to make up a number, 200 couples, right? We go, that means 50 of these couples fit that category. That's a big number. And so I guess one encouragement for people is just, if you're in that number, don't feel like you're weird. So anyway, this conversation is for you, obviously, and for the husband. So just let's get into some of what you've seen that matters, that you can do. So what do you suggest for women who feel that, their marriage may even be struggling because of this, because this is an issue, and it has been maybe for some time?
Well, one of the interesting things that you mentioned, Jeff, was about how thinking this is just that our sex drives are set. And there's been some really interesting research about having a sexual growth mindset. And when you have that kind of mindset, what you basically say is, we're not stuck. It's not we're either compatible or we're not. It's an understanding that there are challenges, just like any other areas of your relationship. And there may be some challenges here. And if you recognize that that might be part of it, then you're much more willing to just relax and kind of work on the issues. And so I would say that first.
Give yourselves a break kind of thing?
Yes. And recognize that this is common, and that all those the 75% of couples too, it doesn't mean that they're not having challenges, or you might have a really good season and then something happens that disrupts that, a health issue or having children or whatever. And for us to just understand that we're going to have to kind of work on this area, and that's okay. And to not feel alone, and to know that there are answers and there are ways to close this gap.
Why is it that women especially, actually, you know what? I don't know that it's women especially. It's probably both men and women feel a bit of shame if they're not in the 75% and they're in the 25%. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think because a lot of the messages about this idea that men always want to have sex. I think it was Billy Crystal's character in City Slickers that said women need to have a reason to have sex, men just need a place.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that is not your experience, you start thinking, what's wrong with me that he doesn't want me? And I must not be desirable. And also, it's unfortunate that sometimes you're then told by people, well-meaning people, oh, well, it's not happening often enough in your marriage. Here's what you do. You need to seduce him. You need to wear the lingerie, do this, and that, which is basically saying you need to make yourself more desirable and then he will want you. When that's not what it's about. That's not the reason that he's not as eager. And so you just feel this letdown that it must be me. There must be something wrong with me. And then do you want to talk about that? You feel bad.
Hearing those words come out of your mouth, Jay, I could have said, I've heard those words hundreds of times from guys.
Yeah.
The higher desire guys.
Yeah.
And saying, well, she just must not desire me. That's the grid that we run it through. And then there is that, kind of discouragement that comes along with that and feeling of, I don't know if shame is too strong of a word, but just almost embarrassment and feeling like you just don't measure up.
It's not that you're not desirable. So can you talk about some of the reasons why maybe a husband's sex drive might be lower?
Sure. I go in the book into this a lot of detail because I started researching reasons and they just kind of kept piling up. And so then I thought, well, this is such a complex thing and I want to cover as many of these as possible so that all the wives will kind of be able to go through and maybe their husbands want to go through with them and say, could it be this one? Could it be this one? And kind of see. But they kind of fall in some sections too, like physical health. And for instance, we know testosterone is very important for the male sex drive, but there are lots of things that affect testosterone. So diet, weight, diabetes, poor sleep, those kinds of things can affect all of that. Chronic illness.
I didn't know that diabetes could impact this. I mean, it makes sense, right? That's interesting. Okay, keep going. Sorry.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of things that deal with just physical health. Then there's some personal history issues. For instance, just childhood abuse is one. I've definitely heard some very rough stories around that. And I think we don't pay enough attention to that. We do thankfully now hear a lot about what some women have gone through with trauma. But a lot of men out there are holding on to really heartbreaking stories and maybe not realizing how much that past has impacted their desire and ability to enjoy sex. But there's also just things like the purity culture hit a lot of men too. And a lot of men suppress their sexuality and have difficulty turning that on when they got married. So, and then I'll just go through a few more. Our stress is a big one. Just a lot of men are stressed.
Well, especially I'm thinking about the more stereotypical family where maybe they have young kids and it's more likely statistically that he's working more hours to provide for the family. I think it's something like 85% of couples, the husband, especially in those years, tends to be the primary breadwinner. And so I can imagine that now you've got little kids, you feel a lot. I'm looking at Jeff here, but I mean, as a guy,
absolutely,
there's got to be stress associated with that may impact the bedroom.
And maybe you could speak to this too, Jeff, because I recognize a lot of men will say they reach a point in their career where they feel a lot of responsibility at work too. And it's hard to come home and let that go.
We often talk in some of our research about how men, we've heard it, compartmentalize, and we can close out a thought perhaps more easily than, say, a woman can. And I know that's making big, broad claims.
Well, statistically, our research found that really clearly,
but,
actually.
Perhaps in the area where it comes to, providing for our families, that just feels like a core insecure place where I am that I have to always keep my eye on the ball on this one. And when I'm keeping my eye on the ball on that one, it leaves less opportunity to think about these other things, like on our relationship, or on this prioritizing, our connectivity around intimacy.
Yeah, I've heard from plenty of higher desire wives who say their husbands will turn down opportunities or just not make time and space for sex because they're working so hard. And then they're saying, well, I'm doing this for us. Or, it could be even, we need to build another room onto the house for a parent they need to care for, or, getting ahead, getting their debt paid down, whatever it is that they're feeling all this responsibility for. And they just have a hard time shaking that off and making playtime, so to speak, in the bedroom
with their wife. Yeah. So Jay, this is getting at the heart of it. So what does that wife do? And what does that husband do? But especially since, you've been talking to so many women, you've heard the success stories and what works, and you've heard what doesn't. So what is it for the wife who's listening and who's saying, okay, so my husband, yeah, he works a lot, and yeah, he's a DIY guy, and he's constantly busy with that. And yeah, what do I do?
Right. I think that whenever you're trying to close this gap of mismatched drives, I think you need to start with some compassion for one another.
Okay.
All too often, it comes across that the higher desire spouse is pressuring to get what they want. And then, so understandably, the lower desire spouse feels like, well, you just want me for this. But actually, what you hear from so many higher desire spouses is what you talked about, Jeff, too, is this desire to be desired. It's not enough to just have sex. It's that you want to be connected. You want to feel that your spouse really wants to be with you in this very intimate way. But just because that's how you feel about it, you need to be careful how you proceed and have compassion for the spouse who doesn't feel this independent drive towards sex. It doesn't mean that they're not valuing the relationship or you. It just means they're built a little differently, or they might have some obstacles that need to be overcome. So I think starting with some compassion and talking about where you're coming from, what's going on, what is it you would really like to see happen, and asking for some baby steps in these areas. You don't have to have a change right away tomorrow. You can start saying things like, I know you're working a lot, and I appreciate everything you're putting into that, but I feel like we're neglecting our relationship some, and especially our sexual intimacy, and I just don't want to let that go. Is it possible that we could add one more time to make love each week? Just schedule it in and see if we can prioritize that.
I think that's fantastic. Now, the question that as I'm hearing you say this, do you know, or the couples that you talk with, do they have those conversations, or prior to your talking to them? That feels like a conversation that, of course, should have.
But it's kind of difficult. Okay, so for those who answer no,
yeah,
how can you have those?
How do you get that?
How can you have those conversations?
Well, I think a lot of these couples they'll talk about sex, but they don't really have a conversation about sex.
Okay, so unpack the difference there. That sounds good. Tell us what you mean.
Well, talking about it is things like, it's been a long time since we've had sex. Or, are we ever going to have sex again? Things like that.
Okay,
or,
I can see how
all you seem to want is sex. So these are
yeah.
talking points, but they're not really a conversation about sex. And so I think that's different, is when you say, I want to open this up in a safe atmosphere for us to discuss what's going on. And I also think you need to recognize that if you're worried it's going to be awkward, that's because it's going to be awkward the first few times. Everything is awkward the first few times. When your children were first walking, those little toddlers, their walking is incredibly awkward. But nobody says, well, they need to stop. It's too awkward.
Yeah, right.
We're like, keep going. You're going to be good at this after a while. And so it's the same thing of, go ahead and realize these are conversations, plural. Launch that first one. Try to get things started. Don't expect everything to be solved at the first one, but you just kind of have to say, I want to talk about this. And recognize that some spouses, it's going to take them a little while before they're comfortable with it. So they may not be saying, oh, that sounds great. Let's open up an hour for a dialogue on this. Just what I wanted to do today. But you can just kind of gently continue to say, I just really want us to talk about it. I want to hear your thoughts. And that's a big part, is making sure that you're going in being curious about your spouse and willing to listen.
And I would imagine that if you are a higher desire wife listening to this, and or you're a lower desire husband, when there have been these conversations and you're trying to, understand one another, there still can be a lot of hurt. There can be a lot of defensiveness. You can feel that sense of you're getting your back up, like it's like I'm being attacked. What are some of the ways that can change? What are some of the things that can cause it to be productive and avoid that third rail of getting all intense that way?
I think you have to go in thinking through your own view of yourself and how does your sexuality play into your identity? Because we entangle this so much. So we go in thinking, well, my sexuality has so much to do with how much my spouse loves me.
Oh, I gotcha.
And that's, like I said, it's very rarely the situation. So often a spouse will say, no, I find you very appealing and I want to be with you. I just don't seem to have this real desire for sex, or I think we're fine. I just like being with you. And they're just expressing it a different way. And so that's really, really hard. But a lot of this is kind of reminding yourself in the conversation mentally what's going on. And I think it's important to have some things that you maybe even memorize. I have found it very helpful to have some scriptures that I memorize that assure me of God's love, of my value, things like that, so that in that moment where I'm feeling triggered and I'm feeling like, he doesn't love me enough, I can be okay. I can say, it's still okay. We can work this out. God's in this situation, and I still have value while we're working on this.
That's so good.
That is great. So, what?
Speaking of,
what role do you see faith and a biblical foundation kind of play in helping couples work through these challenges?
Yeah, well, I think one of the most interesting things is that when we have adopted these stereotypes of men wanting sex and women less, we also sometimes adopted the idea that women needed to serve men, therefore, by giving them the sex they need. These are kinds of the things that some people will relate to this as I say it. But in truth, when you look at scripture, it's amazing how much mutuality there is in the sexual relationship. So Song of Solomon is just filled with this idea that both of them desire to be with one another and enjoy it. As I often say now, God intends sex to be mutually desired and mutually satisfactory. That doesn't mean it's necessarily equally desired or equally satisfactory. Just like, one of you may enjoy conversation a little more than the other. One of you may enjoy your recreation together a little more than the other. That's okay. There's different areas of marriage where we have this. But the mutuality of sex is from Genesis 1 all the way through Song of Solomon, and yes, to 1 Corinthians 7, 3-5, that says that a husband and wife should yield to one another and make sure that sex is part of their marriage. That would have been a stunning statement at the time to give wives the same role, the same expectations there.
I know, I love that.
Yeah.
That men had. That just would have been a stunning statement to that culture.
I love that so much. As we need to wrap up, I'm curious, looking at the book, what's, like, if you had to identify one thing that you hope people will take away from the book, what would that be?
Well, the number one thing I say I want higher desire wives to take away is that they're not alone. Because too many of them have felt alone. They didn't know where to turn for answers. They felt that something was wrong with their relationship. And as you've pointed out beautifully, Shaunti, Jeff, that's not true. It's about a quarter of marriages. And so you're not crazy, you're not weird, and you're not alone. But also, I hope the second thing is to give people some answers. So we go through some reasons here in the book, but I also have a lot of suggestions within each chapter of how to deal with those reasons. And then I have overall advice toward the end on having those conversations and how to work things out, and also how to do some kind of emotional self-care as you're processing through this, because it won't be fixed by tomorrow, but you can make a lot of progress.
Yeah, that's so good.
That's really great. So where can we point our listeners to so that they can find you, Jay?
Well, the place to find me is hotholyhumorous.com. And it's humorous spelled the American way. Sorry, not the Canadian British way.
That's great.
But I think you'll be able to find it there, and you can find through that my books. I have over 1,000 blog posts. Also have a co-hosted podcast with a couple of other women that they can find there. So everything's just kind of there.
And we will put all this in the show notes so that everybody can find you in the stuff. So we want to just say thanks to Jay Parker for coming on the show today. Check out her book, The Higher Desire Wife, and her podcasts. And blogs.
Now have one. Yes. Sex Chat for Christian Wives.
And, many different podcast episodes. Lots of blogs. You can see her details in the show notes. And please share today's episode with folks that you know. There's probably some of you who know. It may be you. It may be others that need it. And tag Jay Parker on all your social media channels. Thanks for listening to I Wish You Could Hear This. Remember to subscribe to our podcast. And as always, forward today's audio or video link to a friend, counselor, or pastor who would be encouraged.